The Romans liked to call themselves the most civilized people on earth, the bringers of law, order, and virtue. But beneath that polished marble surface was a city that thrived on control, humiliation, and ritualized cruelty. Few customs revealed this better than the wedding night tradition that awaited many brides. It was a night they had been raised to both fear and obey, a night when the first man to claim their body was not their husband. For the women of ancient Rome, marriage was never just about love or even family alliances. It was a transaction, a contract between powerful men. The bride herself was often little more than an ornament, a vessel to carry on the bloodline. And so when the torches were lit and the wedding feast ended, she would be led to the bridal chamber with music and ceremony. She might have been trembling with fear because she knew what was about to happen. The man who entered the room was not her new husband. He was a stranger, sometimes a priest, sometimes a high-ranking magistrate, sometimes even a family elder. And his job was to purify the bride before her husband could ever touch her. Imagine the terror of being barely 14, dressed in bridal white, surrounded by strangers who watched you like an offering being prepared for sacrifice. The Romans believed that the first act of intimacy carried spiritual power. It could bless or curse the entire marriage. To ensure this sacred duty was properly performed, they entrusted it to someone they believed represented the gods. This was not romance, it was ritual, and for the bride, it was humiliation. Roman writers hint at this custom with unsettling casualness, describing how brides were given over for the night, as though they were temple property. Some accounts even suggest that guests or witnesses were present, there to ensure the ritual was carried out correctly. Privacy, in these moments, was not a right. It was denied on purpose. A Roman wedding night could feel more like a public trial than an intimate union. For the men of Rome, this custom reinforced two ideas: that women were property and that male power came first. The bride's body was effectively consecrated to the gods through another man's touch, and then handed over to the groom as though she had been properly initiated. It was, to Roman minds, an act of purification, but to the girl living it, it was an invasion she could never forget. Some historians believe these rituals were left deliberately vague in writing, a kind of cultural secret, but the fragments we do have are chilling. We know that the bride's consent was irrelevant, that this ritual had legal weight, and that refusing it could mean the marriage was invalid. In the eyes of Rome, her body was not hers and it was Rome's. For the bride, the ritual was not just physical, it was psychological warfare. In the hours before the ceremony, she was often kept in a kind of sacred isolation. Female relatives would dress her carefully, braiding her hair in a special bridal style that symbolized her submission. They sang songs and offered prayers, but none of it could hide the fact that she was about to be stripped of control over her own body. By the time she was led to the chamber, she was more an object than a person. Roman poets even compared brides to sacrificial animals, noting that they were given away with the same solemnity as an offering on the altar. The door was closed, the torches burned low, and the stranger approached her. Perhaps a priest, perhaps a magistrate, perhaps a man she had never spoken to before. He did not ask her consent. He did not need to. Roman law said her father had already given it on her behalf when he arranged the marriage. The worst part was that this ritual was public knowledge. Everyone in the household, from the slaves to the groom himself, knew what was happening behind that door. There was no illusion of privacy, no comforting lie that the night belonged to the couple. Instead, the bride was expected to endure it in silence, as proof of her obedience. If she cried out, if she tried to resist, it could bring shame on the family. Neighbors and relatives might whisper that the gods had been offended, that the marriage was cursed. Even the groom's role was strangely passive. He would wait, sometimes sitting with friends or drinking wine, until he was summoned. Only then would he be told that his bride had been purified and was now ready to be touched by him. In some accounts, he was expected to perform his own act of intimacy immediately afterward, as if competing with the stranger who had gone before him. For a young groom, this could be a humiliation of its own, an unspoken reminder that his wife had been initiated by someone else first. It is difficult for modern minds to imagine how normal this was considered. Roman society was built on ritual, and this was seen as just another step in the process of joining two families. But to the brides who endured it, the fear could leave scars that lasted a lifetime. Some ancient writers even describe young women fainting or having to be physically carried into the room. Others hint that some brides never recovered. They fell into deep despair, refused to speak, or became distant from their husbands. And yet, this ritual served an important political purpose. It reminded everyone present that marriage in Rome was not about personal happiness. It was about duty to the gods, duty to the family, and above all, duty to Rome. The bride's body was a canvas on which society wrote its laws, and that first night was the proof that she had submitted to them. Resistance was rare, but when it happened, Rome made sure everyone learned the price. If a bride screamed, fought back, or refused to enter the chamber, she risked more than her own safety. Roman law gave the paterfamilias, her father, nearly absolute power over her life. He could beat her, disown her, even order her death if he believed she had dishonored the family. A daughter who disrupted the ritual was seen as not just disobedient, but dangerous. Some sources suggest that unwilling brides could be dragged into the ritual space by force, restrained by attendants while the stranger performed his role. Others hint at something darker, that public punishment could follow. Roman moralists often wrote that a rebellious bride must be taught obedience, implying that humiliation was part of the process. She might be displayed before the household, scolded by relatives, or even struck to make an example of her. The fear was carefully cultivated. From childhood, Roman girls were taught that their bodies were not their own. They were told that a woman's purpose was to bear legitimate children, and that marriage was the moment when she passed from her father's control to her husband's. The ritual of the wedding night was simply the visible proof that this transfer had taken place. A girl who resisted was challenging not just her family but the order of Rome itself, and Rome did not tolerate defiance. The silence of the other women was part of the punishment. Even the bride's mother was expected to watch quietly, perhaps shedding a tear, but never intervening. By doing nothing, she showed that she too accepted the ritual, that she too had endured it once. In this way, the cycle of fear passed from one generation to the next. For the men, the ritual reinforced power. The stranger who claimed the bride first became a symbol of authority. He stood for the law, the gods, the ancestors. By submitting to him, the bride symbolically submitted to Rome. And when the groom finally entered, he inherited a wife who had already been shaped, humbled, frightened, and bound to him by the memory of that night. But not every story ended so neatly. Ancient writers whisper of brides who never recovered, who went mad or took their own lives, rather than face the ritual again. Some wealthy families petitioned to have the ritual waived, arguing that it had already been performed on an earlier daughter, or that their house was especially pious. Others sent their daughters away to distant relatives for the wedding, hoping to escape the local magistrate's claim on them. These exceptions were rare, but they reveal that even in Rome, not everyone accepted the ritual without question. The most chilling accounts, though, describe how some grooms came to relish the tradition. For them, the ritual was not a humiliation, but a spectacle. Proof that their bride was desirable enough to be claimed, and that she had been properly tamed before she ever became theirs. Some men even invited friends or fellow soldiers to witness the purification, turning it into a grotesque performance, where the woman's fear became entertainment. And for the state, this was precisely the point. The ritual reminded every Roman that private life was never entirely private. The bedroom itself was part of the public order, and the bride's body was one more space where Rome's power could be demonstrated. Ancient historians did not always describe these rituals openly, but if you know where to look, the traces are everywhere. Livy writes of Rome's early kings holding confariatio weddings, ceremonies so sacred that even the gods were said to attend. But he hints that the bride's consent was not required. The ritual meal of spelt bread shared by bride and groom was followed by a night of transference, where the bride was taken away to a separate room under the watch of witnesses. Livy's language is deliberately vague, but it leaves no doubt that the bride's first night was a public affair, not a private one. Plutarch gives us more direct evidence. In his Roman Questions, he writes of a strange custom where the bride was symbolically abducted, from her mother's arms and carried across the threshold as though she were a prisoner of war. This was not just playful pageantry. It was a reminder that marriage was a form of conquest, and the bride was the prize. Some scholars believe that what happened behind closed doors continued that theme, reducing the bride to property to be claimed before the husband's marriage could truly begin. Other sources go even further. The jurist Gaius records that in some patrician houses, the high priest of Jupiter, the Flamen Dialis, had the right to oversee a bride's initiation to ensure she was ritually pure. While Gaius does not describe what that oversight entailed, later writers like Augustine of Hippo condemned these pagan practices as indecent, suggesting that the presence of an outsider in the bridal chamber was more than symbolic. Then there are the rumors preserved in early Christian texts. Tertullian, writing in the 2nd century, rails against what he calls impious rites that allowed a priest or magistrate to profane the nuptial bed before the lawful husband. Christian writers used these accounts to attack Roman morality, accusing the empire of sanctifying sexual violation under the guise of religion. Whether exaggerated or not, these accusations suggest that even in antiquity, some Romans found the practice disturbing. There are also stories of brides who were spared, and what that sparing cost their families. Valerius Maximus tells of one nobleman who bribed a magistrate with a year's worth of grain so that his daughter could go directly to her husband's bed without the ritual. The fact that such bribes existed at all shows how seriously people took the ceremony and how much fear it inspired. What is most unsettling is how Rome wrapped all of this in legality. The ritual was not seen as a crime, but as a civic duty, one that preserved the sanctity of marriage and the lineage of the elite. By inserting the state into the most intimate moment of a woman's life, Rome ensured that no bride could forget who truly owned her body, not her husband, not even her father, but the Republic itself. For the modern listener, this is almost impossible to comprehend. The idea that a woman's first night of marriage might involve a stranger, sanctioned by law, seems like something out of a nightmare. And yet in Rome, it was precisely this nightmare that created order, an order built on control, fear, and submission. If the practice itself wasn't disturbing enough, what truly chills the blood are the stories of when it was used as a weapon. In a system where power decided who could and could not touch a bride on her wedding night, the line between ritual and abuse was razor thin. Take the case of Lucius Quinctius, a magistrate whose political enemies claimed he humiliated his rivals by ordering their daughters' bridal ceremonies delayed, then stepping in to inspect the brides himself. Roman gossip writers whisper that he did not simply observe but took liberties, reducing these young women to pawns in his personal vendettas. Whether entirely true or exaggerated, the fact that such accusations circulated tells us something terrifying. People believed this kind of abuse was possible, maybe even common. There are also accounts of the rite being staged, not in private homes, but in public halls, with a crowd of witnesses. One fragmentary source mentions a wedding in which a group of male relatives, not just the priest or magistrate, took turns testing the bride while the groom watched in silence. This was not law but cruelty disguised as tradition, and it shows how easily ritual could slide into spectacle. Sometimes the bride's humiliation became a form of public entertainment. Suetonius hints that Emperor Tiberius, infamous for his perverse appetites, demanded that certain noble brides be brought to his villa on Capri before they were allowed to wed. The emperor, it was said, would examine their modesty personally, a euphemism so transparent it hardly needs explaining. In these cases, the ritual was no longer about ensuring fertility or social order. It became an assertion of absolute power, the emperor reminding Rome's elite that even their most private moments belonged to him. The psychological effect on these women must have been devastating. Imagine being prepared for your wedding night your whole life, only to have that moment stolen and twisted into a performance for someone else's authority. Ancient Roman writers rarely cared about the bride's feelings. They focused on the honor of her family or the legitimacy of future heirs. But the silence in the sources is deafening, a silence that suggests these women were expected to endure their fate without protest. their suffering serving as the foundation of Roman social stability. And what of the grooms? Surprisingly, there are records of men who accepted this ritual as necessary, even desirable. For some, it was proof that their wives had been properly cleansed or approved. For others, it may have been an excuse to distance themselves emotionally from the first night, leaving the burden of intimacy to someone else. Either way, it stripped marriage of romance and turned it into a transaction, with the bride's body as the currency. These abuses turned what was already a troubling custom into a nightmare. They reveal a Rome that was not merely pragmatic, but brutally creative in its control over women. The wedding night was supposed to symbolize unity, but in many cases, it became the moment when a woman learned, in the most personal way possible, that she had no power over her own body. There were women, however, who refused to accept this ritual quietly. These stories are rare, partly because women who resisted were often erased from the historical record, but enough survived to show just how high the stakes were. One account speaks of a young bride from a patrician family who reportedly bit the priest who tried to approach her on her wedding night. Her family's reaction was not pride, but terror. They feared that her defiance might anger the gods, or worse, bring disgrace upon their house. The punishment was swift and cruel. She was sent back to her father as home in disgrace, the marriage annulled, and she was later forced into a shame marriage with a much older man, a punishment designed to humiliate her further. Other stories end far more violently. In the annals of Valerius Maximus, there is a tale of a bride who took her own life rather than be touched by the appointed official on her wedding night. The historian praises her virtue, but offers no condemnation of the system that drove her to such despair. Instead, her death was treated as a cautionary tale, not against the ritual itself, but against resisting it. The cruelest fate awaited those whose families could not protect them. Poor brides had no powerful relatives to shield them, and their wedding nights were often far more public and degrading. In some rural regions, we hear of local magistrates insisting that entire wedding parties watch as the ritual was carried out, claiming that public witnessing ensured purity and lawful union. The bride's tears were dismissed as weakness, her silence taken as consent. Resistance could even be seen as sacrilege. A bride who refused was said to bring bad fortune not just to her husband, but to the entire community. If a harvest failed or a drought struck in the following year, neighbors might whisper that it was because the marriage had not been properly sanctioned. The woman would become a scapegoat, blamed for disasters entirely beyond her control. Some husbands, though not all, quietly shared in their wives' suffering. In one story, a young groom tried to confront the official who had humiliated his bride, only to be arrested and publicly flogged for challenging sacred custom. The message was clear. This was not about love, not about two people starting a life together. It was about reminding everyone where real power lay. For those who endured it, the ritual marked them forever. Writers describe brides who became withdrawn, refusing intimacy for months or even years after marriage. Others were said to suffer from nightmares, convinced that the gods were punishing them for what had happened, even though they had no choice in the matter. And yet the practice endured, generation after generation, because Rome was a society obsessed with control, with order, with making sure every citizen's life followed the pattern laid out by tradition. The wedding night test was not simply about fertility. It was about obedience. It was a warning to every Roman girl watching from the shadows that her body did not belong to her. It belonged to Rome. For many women, the trauma of that night was not something that could be left behind once the ritual was over. In fact, it followed them through every stage of their lives, coloring how they viewed their husbands, their families, and even their own children. Ancient Roman writers rarely admit this directly, but the silences in their accounts speak volumes. They praised obedient wives who never spoke of what had been done to them, who played their part in public and gave Rome the children it demanded. But when those same women failed to conceive, the blame often returned to that night. Whispered accusations claimed that the goddess had turned away from them, that their wombs had been cursed for failing to accept the ritual. This meant they could be divorced, humiliated, and replaced by younger brides, who would be put through the same test, perpetuating the cycle. The psychological scars ran deep. Imagine being a bride, standing at your own wedding feast, knowing that every woman present had gone through the same ordeal. Their approving nods and polite smiles would not comfort you. They would remind you that your suffering was simply tradition, something you were expected to endure as proof of your worthiness. Some women turned their pain into power. Roman history is filled with influential matrons who wielded quiet control over their households and even over their husbands' careers. Scholars now wonder whether part of their relentless drive for influence came from an early lesson that no one else would protect them, so they had to protect themselves. In this way, the ritual may have created not just victims, but survivors who reshaped Roman politics from behind the scenes. Still, the human cost was immense. In certain regions, brides who died in childbirth, a tragically common occurrence, were buried with special rites meant to appease the gods, as though their death was repayment for some cosmic debt. The implication was chilling, that their suffering had been ordained from the moment they were taken on their wedding night. Roman poets, too, hinted at the darkness lurking under the surface of what was supposed to be the happiest night of a woman's life. Ovid, ever the provocateur, wrote cryptic verses about the stranger who claims the bride before her husband's embrace, verses so controversial that later, scholars tried to reinterpret them as metaphor rather than admission. This is where the story turns truly disturbing, because even after the practice was abolished, Rome could not seem to let go of the idea that a bride's first night should be a trial of obedience. Later emperors would revive the ritual in twisted new forms, using it as entertainment for the court, or as a way to break the spirits of conquered peoples. It is here, in the final part, that we see just how far this obsession went. How Rome took what was already cruel and made it into a spectacle, a ritual not just of power, but of humiliation, broadcast to all who dared resist. As the centuries passed, Rome's hunger for control and for spectacle only grew. What had once been a private ritual carried out in near silence became, under certain emperors, a public display of dominance. Ancient sources whisper that some rulers revived the old tradition, but stripped it of any sacred pretense. Now it was no longer about appeasing the gods. It was about reminding every Roman citizen who truly owned their lives. There are accounts of wedding nights held in the presence of magistrates, soldiers, even cheering crowds. The bride dressed in white was paraded not to the altar of a goddess, but to the steps of a temple or the center of a banquet hall, where a stranger chosen by the state, sometimes a soldier, sometimes a priest, sometimes even a slave, would perform the ritual that was supposed to prepare her for marriage. The groom, humiliated, was forced to watch, knowing that only after the state was finished with his bride could she ever belong to him. This was more than a cruel tradition. It was psychological warfare. Rome understood that breaking the spirit of a population was as important as breaking its armies. If a man could not even protect his wife on her wedding night, what else might he dare to challenge? If a woman's first memory of married life was submission to a stranger, how likely was she to rebel against the social order? In the worst accounts, the ordeal was used as punishment. Defeated tribes were forced to marry under Roman law, and their brides were subjected to this ritual in front of their people, turning what should have been a celebration into a display of Rome's supremacy. Some historians even suggest this practice helped prevent uprisings. Fear was a far stronger chain than any manacle, but Rome, for all its power, could not erase memory. Over time, resentment simmered. Later, Christian writers denounced the practice as barbaric, and as the empire fell, the custom faded into obscurity. Yet its shadow remained. Medieval Europe inherited echoes of it in the form of the notorious droit du seigneur, the so-called lord's right, to a bride on her wedding night, a practice that may have been more myth than fact, but whose very existence as a rumor speaks volumes about what people feared most. What makes this story so haunting is not just the cruelty of the ritual itself, but its purpose. Rome's wedding night ordeal was never really about religion or fertility, or even tradition. It was about power, raw, absolute power, and the need to remind every Roman, every ally, and every conquered foe that the state was always watching, always in control, even in the most intimate corners of life. And that, perhaps, is why this story was nearly erased from history. It is easier to remember Rome as a place of marble forums and heroic battles than to face the truth that its might was built on fear, and that thousands of young brides paid the price for that illusion of glory. So the next time we think of Rome as the cradle of Western civilization, we must also remember the women who walked down the aisle knowing that their wedding night would not belong to them, that they were about to become another sacrifice to the eternal city's hunger for domination.